Xavier Harlow learned 3 things the day the orc woman knocked on his door. Seed invoices made terrible contracts. His handwriting was worse than he remembered. And saying no to a 5-year-old child with enormous brown eyes was physically impossible. The woman stood on his porch with her son half hidden behind her skirts, both of them dusty from the road. She had the green skin and small tusks common to her kind, pointed ears that twitched when she spoke, and an athletic build that spoke of hard work rather than soft living. Her name was Elara. She explained in a voice that carried the weariness of someone who had knocked on too many doors that day. And she needed a room for 1 week, while the wheelwright in town fixed a cracked axle on her wagon. "I can pay," she said quickly, before Xavier could even open his mouth. 3 silver for the week. We will not be trouble." Xavier stood in his doorway, a man of 32 who had buried his wife 2 winters past and learned to live with silence. He was tall and lean from farm work, with dark hair that needed cutting and hands that bore the permanent stains of soil. His farmhouse had 4 rooms, 2 of which he never entered anymore, and his first instinct was to say he did not rent to travelers. But the boy peered around his mother's hip at that moment, and Xavier saw the exhaustion in that small face. The child could not have been more than 5, with his mother's green skin and his father's absent shadow. "The room has a bed," Xavier heard himself say. "Might need fresh linens." Elara's shoulders dropped half an inch, relief bleeding through her careful composure. "Thank you. We will stay out of your way." That was how Xavier found himself sitting at his kitchen table an hour later, scratching terms onto the back of a seed invoice because he had no proper paper and too much pride to walk to town for some. The ink was running low, his quill kept catching, and Elara watched him write with an expression that suggested she was rethinking her choice of lodging. 1 week, Xavier said, underlining it twice. 3 silver, paid at the end. You use the east bedroom. Kitchen is shared, but clean up after yourself. No loud noise after dark. The well is out back, privy beyond that." "Agreed," Elara said. She glanced at her son, who had fallen asleep in the chair beside her, his head pillowed on his arms. "Corwin is quiet. He will not disturb you." Xavier nodded and signed his name, then slid the invoice across the table. Elara signed below him in a neat, careful hand that put his scrawl to shame. "Dinner is in an hour," Xavier said, because the words came out before he could stop them. "If you are hungry." Elara blinked. "That was not part of the agreement." "No," Xavier agreed, "but I am making stew regardless. Easier to make enough for 3 than 1. That first dinner was an exercise in awkward silence. Xavier set out bowls and spoons while Elara woke Corwin and got him settled at the table. The boy was shy, eyes downcast, eating his stew in tiny bites as if afraid to make noise. Elara ate with precise efficiency, thanking Xavier twice for the meal and asking no questions. Xavier had grown used to eating alone, used to the sound of his own chewing and the creak of the house settling around him. Having others at his table felt strange, like wearing a coat that no longer fit quite right. But it was not unpleasant exactly, just different. "The stew is very good," Elara offered when the silence stretched too long. "It is just rabbit and vegetables," Xavier said. "Still good," Elara insisted, and then they lapsed back into quiet. After dinner, Elara washed the dishes without being asked, working at the basin with the same efficient movements she brought to eating. Corwin helped dry, standing on a stool to reach the counter. Xavier watched them from the corner of his eye, pretending to read a week-old news sheet, and wondered what circumstances had put an orc woman and her son on the road alone. He did not ask. It was not his business, and in a week they would be gone regardless. The next morning, Xavier woke before dawn as always and went out to tend his fields. He grew wheat and barley on 20 acres, enough to keep himself fed and supplied with a modest income. The work was solitary and suited him fine. He did not look back at the house as he headed toward the fields, did not think about his guests. When he returned at midday for water, he found Elara in his kitchen garden, pulling weeds. "You do not have to do that," Xavier said. Elara straightened, wiping dirt from her hands. "I know. But Corwin is playing and I do not sit idle well. Your onions were being choked." Xavier looked at the neat rows she had cleared, the pile of dandelions and chickweed beside her. "Thank you," he managed. "It is nothing," Elara said, but she looked pleased. That became the pattern. Xavier worked his fields. Elara found tasks around the house. She mended a tear in his kitchen curtain he had not noticed. She reorganized his pantry so that things were easier to find. She swept the floors and beat the dust from the rugs and never once acted as if these things were owed. Corwin played in the yard, building elaborate structures from sticks and stones. Sometimes Xavier would see the boy watching him work, those big brown eyes tracking his movements with solemn curiosity. On the fourth day, Xavier came in from the fields to find Corwin crying on the porch steps, clutching a broken wooden horse. "What happened?" Xavier asked, crouching down to the boy's level. "It broke," Corwin sobbed, holding out the toy. One of the legs had snapped clean off. Xavier took the horse, examining it. The carving was crude but clearly beloved, worn smooth from handling. "May I try to fix it?" Corwin nodded, wiping his nose on his sleeve. Xavier went to his workshop, Corwin trailing behind him like a shadow. The boy watched in silence as Xavier found a bit of wood that matched, whittled it down to size, and glued it carefully into place. It took the better part of an hour, but when Xavier handed the horse back, good as new, Corwin's smile was bright enough to light the dim workshop. "Thank you, sir," Corwin whispered. Xavier corrected. "You can call me Xavier." That evening at dinner, Corwin asked Xavier about farming. How did seeds grow? Why did some plants need more water than others? What did the chickens eat? Xavier answered each question patiently, surprised by how much he enjoyed explaining things to the curious child. Elara listened, her expression soft. "You do not have to entertain him," she said when Corwin finally ran out of questions. "I do not mind," Xavier said, and meant it. The week ended on the 7th day, as weeks do. Xavier did not mention it. Elara did not mention it. The wheelwright had finished the wagon repairs on day 5, but somehow that information never came up. Instead, Elara made breakfast that morning, frying eggs and toasting bread while Xavier pretended to read the same news sheet for the 3rd time. Corwin sat at the table, arranging small stones in complicated patterns. "The harvest will begin soon," Elara said, not quite looking at Xavier. "Yes," Xavier agreed. "You will need help," Elara continued. "It is too much for one person, I manage. But you could use an extra pair of hands," Elara pressed. She turned to face him, her green fingers twisted together. "I am strong, I know farm work. And Corwin could start school in the village. He needs that, needs to be around other children." Xavier set down the news sheet. "How long are you thinking through harvest?" Elara said quickly. "Just through harvest, and then we will leave, I promise. I will pay more rent, of course." "Whatever is fair." Xavier thought about his too-quiet house, about coming home to find weeds pulled and curtains mended and a boy who asked questions about chickens, about dinners that were no longer silent. "Keep the 3 silver you already owe me," he said. "Help with harvest and we will call it even." Elara's face transformed with relief. "Thank you, truly. We will not be trouble." They were not trouble. Elara worked in the fields beside him as harvest began, her strength matching his own. She could lift heavy sacks of grain, work the scythe with practiced ease, keep pace through long days under the hot sun. Xavier found himself grateful for her help and for her company, though he would not have said so aloud. Corwin started school in the village. The teacher, a stern woman named Mistress Renwick, had reservations about teaching an orc child, but Corwin's politeness and eagerness to learn won her over within a week. He came home each day bursting with new knowledge, telling Xavier and Elara about letters and numbers and the names of all the kingdoms. Autumn turned the fields gold. Xavier and Elara worked side by side, falling into an easy rhythm. She learned his habits, the way he liked to start each morning checking the eastern fields first, the way he preferred silence until he had finished his first cup of coffee. He learned hers, the way she hummed while she worked, the way she always checked on Corwin 3 times before bed. They did not speak of her leaving. Winter came, and with it a snowstorm that buried the roads for a week. Elara and Corwin stayed. They celebrated the midwinter festival together, Xavier carving a set of wooden animals for Corwin and Elara making a feast that filled the house with warmth and good smells. "I should have left months ago," Elara said one evening, when Corwin was asleep and she and Xavier sat by the fire. "Yes," Xavier agreed. "But I do not want to," she admitted. "I know," Xavier said, and that was all. Spring arrived. Xavier taught Corwin how to plant seeds, how to space them properly and cover them with just enough soil. The boy took to it with enthusiasm, his small hands gentle with the fragile seedlings. Elara watched them together, and Xavier felt her gaze like a physical warmth. 1 year became 2. They never discussed it, never renegotiated the lease. Elara and Corwin simply stayed, and Xavier simply let them. The village grew accustomed to seeing them together at market, Elara and Xavier walking side by side while Corwin darted ahead, chattering about school or his friends or whatever caught his interest. Some people whispered. An orc and a human, living together under one roof, unmarried. It was scandalous, improper. But Xavier had never cared much about gossip, and Elara held her head high and ignored the stares. Mistress Renwick became an unexpected ally. When another parent complained about Corwin being in class with human children, she shut down the criticism with a sharp lecture about the value of education for all. The blacksmith, a gruff man named Torrance, employed Elara part-time in his shop and paid her fair wages without comment. Xavier found himself thinking of Elara at odd moments, the way she laughed when Corwin said something clever, the way her hair caught the sunlight, the way she fit into his life as if she had always been there. He was falling in love with her, had been falling for months, maybe years. The realization did not surprise him so much as settle over him like something inevitable. But Xavier Harlow was not a man of words. He had never been eloquent, never been good at expressing emotions aloud. His first wife had teased him about it, the way he would buy her flowers instead of saying he loved her, the way he showed affection through actions rather than speech. So he showed Elara without telling her. He built a chair for the kitchen, sized to her height, because she had been using one that left her feet dangling. He left coffee warming on the stove each morning because she always woke cold. He mended Corwin's clothes and repaired his toys and taught the boy to read beyond what he learned in school. Elara noticed. Of course she did. She started leaving small gifts in return. A jar of jam made from wild berries, a patch sewn onto his favorite jacket. A book she found at market that she thought he might enjoy. They danced around each other, neither willing to name what was growing between them. 2 years became 3. It was a land agent who finally forced the issue. A man named Perkins, sent from the regional office to update property records. He arrived one morning in late summer, clipboard in hand and suspicion in his eyes. "Mr. Harlow," Perkins said, standing in Xavier's doorway, "I am here to confirm the details of your land ownership and household." "Everything is in order," Xavier said. "That remains to be seen," Perkins replied. He consulted his papers. "My records show you are a widower living alone, but the village reports indicate an orc woman and child are residing on your property. Can you explain this arrangement?" Xavier's jaw tightened. "I have a tenant." "A tenant," Perkins repeated, his tone suggesting disbelief. "For how long?" "3 years." Perkins's eyebrows rose. 3 years is quite a long tenancy. You have a lease agreement. Xavier thought of the seed invoice, tucked away in a drawer somewhere, its terms long since expired. "We have an understanding." "An understanding," Perkins said. He made a note on his clipboard. "Mr. Harlow, you must understand how this looks. An unmarried man and woman living together, of different species no less. There are propriety concerns, moral concerns. If you are simply renting a room, that is one matter, but this appears to be something else entirely." "It is none of your business," Xavier said flatly. "Actually, it is very much my business," Perkins countered. "Property taxes, household size, marital status, all of these factors affect regional assessments. Furthermore, there are community standards to uphold. If this is merely a landlord-tenant relationship, I need documentation. If it is something else, well—" He let the sentence hang. Elara appeared in the doorway behind Xavier. She must have heard voices. "Is there a problem?" Perkins looked her up and down with barely concealed distaste. "I was just explaining to Mr. Harlow that your living arrangement requires clarification." "We rent a room," Elara said, her voice carefully neutral. "Nothing more, for 3 years." "Is there a law against long-term tenancy?" Elara asked. "No," Perkins admitted. "But there are questions about propriety, about the nature of the relationship, about whether this household is being accurately reported for tax purposes." Xavier felt anger rising in his chest. "I pay my taxes. My household is my own business. Unless you have some legal requirement I am failing to meet, I believe we are done here." Perkins's mouth thinned. "I will be filing a report with the regional office. They may have further questions. Good day, Mr. Harlow." He left, and Xavier watched him go with a sense of dread settling in his stomach. "That was unpleasant," Elara said quietly. "Yes. He will make trouble if he can," she continued. "People like him always do. I should leave, Xavier. I should have left 2 years ago. I am putting you at risk." "No," Xavier said, the word coming out harder than he intended. Elara blinked. "No, no," Xavier repeated. He turned to face her fully. "You are not leaving. Xavier, be reasonable. If the regional office decides there is something improper happening here, they could fine you, could take your land. I will not let that happen because of me." "The only thing improper is Perkins's attitude," Xavier said. "Let him file his report. I do not care." "I care," Elara said, her voice rising. "I care that you could lose everything because I was too selfish to leave when I should have. I care that Corwin and I have imposed on your kindness for 3 years. I care that the entire village is talking about us." "Let them talk," Xavier said. "Why?" Elara demanded. "Why does it not bother you? Why do you want us to stay?" The question hung in the air between them. Xavier looked at Elara, at the woman who had somehow become essential to his life, and knew he could not avoid this anymore. "Because I love you," he said simply. Elara stared at him. "What? I love you," Xavier repeated. "I have loved you for a long time. You and Corwin both. I do not want you to leave. I never wanted you to leave." Elara's eyes were wide, her mouth slightly open. "Xavier, I do not know what to say." "Say you feel the same," Xavier said. "Or say you do not, but say something." "I feel the same," Elara whispered. I have felt the same for so long. I thought you only tolerated us, that you were too kind to ask us to go. I never imagined you might actually want us here." Relief flooded through Xavier. "I want you here. I want you to stay, permanently." "How?" Elara asked. "Perkins made it clear that our arrangement is unacceptable as it stands." Xavier thought about that. Thought about the seed invoice in his drawer, about the house that had felt like a home again these past 3 years, about the boy who called him by his first name and the woman he loved. "Then we change the arrangement," he said. Over the next few days, Xavier thought about Perkins's visit and what it meant. The land agent had been clear that their undefined situation was the problem. A simple tenancy for 3 years looked suspicious, but a marriage would be unassailable. Xavier had been carrying his grandmother's ring in his pocket for 6 months, waiting for the right moment to offer it. He had inherited it after his first wife died, had kept it tucked away until Elara came into his life. Now it seemed the right moment had arrived, though not in the way he had imagined. He was not good with speeches or grand gestures. He was a farmer, a man of simple means and simpler words, but he knew how to make his intentions clear. One evening after dinner, when Corwin was outside catching fireflies in the yard, Xavier sat down at the kitchen table with a piece of good paper he had bought in town. Elara was washing dishes, her back to him, humming softly. Xavier wrote carefully, his penmanship still terrible but legible. When he finished, he read it over twice, then set down his quill. "Elara," he said. She turned, wiping her hands on a towel. "Yes, come sit with me." Elara sat, her expression curious. "What is this about?" Xavier slid the paper across the table to her. "Read this." Elara picked up the paper and began to read. Her eyes moved across the lines once, then again, her expression shifting from confusion to understanding to something that looked like joy. Xavier had written a marriage contract. It was simple and direct, laying out that Elara Kine would become Xavier Harlow, that Corwin would be adopted as Xavier's son, that they would be a legal family in the eyes of the law and the community. There were provisions about shared property, about inheritance, about all the practical matters that marriages required. At the bottom, Xavier had signed his name. Below that was a blank line for Elara's signature. "Xavier," Elara breathed, looking up at him with tears in her eyes. "Is this real?" Xavier reached into his pocket and pulled out the ring. It was a simple band of silver with a small green stone, nothing fancy but well made. He set it on the table between them. "I should have asked properly," he said. "Should have gotten down on one knee and made a pretty speech. But I am not good at speeches, and I think you know that by now. I love you, Elara. I want to marry you. I want Corwin to be my son. I want us to be a family, not just people sharing a house. Will you marry me?" Elara laughed, the sound watery and bright. "You are proposing with a contract." "It seemed fitting," Xavier said, "given that we started with one." Elara picked up the ring, holding it up to the lamplight. "It is beautiful." "It was my grandmother's," Xavier said. "She would have liked you." "Yes," Elara said, sliding the ring onto her finger. "It fit perfectly." "Yes, I will marry you. I will be your wife. Corwin will be so happy." She signed the contract with steady hands, her signature next to his. Then she stood, circled the table, and kissed Xavier for the first time. It was a good kiss, warm and sweet and full of promise. Xavier wrapped his arms around her, holding her close, and thought that he had never been happier than in this moment. Corwin burst through the door a moment later, jar of fireflies in hand, and stopped short. "Are you kissing?" "Yes," Elara said, laughing. "Why?" Corwin asked. "Because Xavier and I are getting married," Elara explained. "He is going to be your father." Corwin's eyes went huge. "Really?" "Really," Xavier confirmed. Corwin set down the jar carefully, then launched himself at Xavier, wrapping his arms around his waist. I always wanted you to be my father." Xavier hugged the boy tightly, feeling something in his chest unclench. "I would be honored." They married a month later in a small ceremony at the village church. Mistress Renwick attended, along with Torrance the blacksmith and a handful of other villagers who had grown fond of the unconventional family. Corwin stood beside Xavier, solemn and proud in his new clothes, and Elara wore a simple green dress that matched her skin and made her look radiant. The priest, an elderly man named Father Thomas, performed the ceremony without comment on the bride's species. He had known Xavier since childhood and trusted his judgment. When he pronounced them husband and wife, Elara and Xavier kissed to scattered applause, and Corwin cheered loud enough to make people laugh. The wedding feast was held at the farmhouse. Elara and Xavier had spent days preparing food, and their guests brought more. There was roasted chicken and fresh bread, vegetable stews and berry pies, cider and ale and wine. Tables were set up in the yard, and people ate and drank and celebrated into the evening. Torrance gave a rambling toast about the value of hard work and good partnerships. Mistress Renwick wished them happiness, and told Corwin he had better keep up with his studies, even with all the excitement. Father Thomas blessed the house and the marriage and left early with a plate of food. When the last guests departed and the house was quiet again, Xavier and Elara sat on the porch steps together, Corwin asleep upstairs in his room. The ring on Elara's finger caught the moonlight, and she smiled at it. "3 years ago I knocked on your door asking for a room for 1 week," she said. "I never imagined it would lead to this." "Neither did I," Xavier admitted, "but I am glad it did." "So am I," Elara said. She leaned her head on his shoulder. "Thank you for fixing Corwin's toy horse that day. I think that was when I started falling in love with you." "That early?" Xavier asked, surprised. "You were so patient with him," Elara said. "So kind. I knew then that you were a good man. Everything after only confirmed it." Xavier kissed the top of her head. "I am not special. I just did what felt right." "That is what makes you special," Elara said. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars and listening to the night sounds of the farm. Xavier thought about the seed invoice in his drawer, the one that had started everything, and made a mental note to keep it. Someday he would show it to Corwin, tell him the story of how his parents met. Life settled into a new rhythm after the wedding. Elara was no longer a tenant but a wife, no longer helping with harvest as a favor but as a partner in the farm. Corwin was no longer a guest but a son, learning the work and growing stronger each day. Xavier filed the marriage certificate with the regional office, and Perkins's concerns disappeared like morning mist. There was nothing improper about a married couple living together, nothing scandalous about a man and his wife running a farm. The gossip died down as the village moved on to newer, more interesting topics. Autumn came again, the third harvest since Elara and Corwin had arrived. The fields were heavy with grain, the yield better than Xavier had managed in years. He and Elara worked together to bring in the crops, Corwin helping where he could, and by the time they finished, Xavier's barns were full to bursting. They held a harvest supper in late autumn, inviting their neighbors and friends to celebrate the season's bounty. Tables were piled with food, lanterns hung from the trees, and a local musician played cheerful tunes on a fiddle. Children ran through the yard playing tag while adults talked and laughed. Xavier stood near the house, watching the festivities with satisfaction. Elara was nearby, talking with Mistress Renwick about Corwin's progress in school. The boy himself was playing with several other children, his laughter bright and clear. Torrance approached with 2 mugs of cider, handing one to Xavier. "Fine harvest this year." "Best I have had," Xavier agreed. Having help makes a difference, Torrance observed. A good wife, a good son, you are a lucky man. I know, Xavier said. Corwin broke away from the other children and ran up to Xavier, breathless and smiling. Father, can we light the bonfire now? Everyone wants to see it. Xavier froze, the word hitting him like a physical blow. Father. Corwin had been calling him Xavier for 3 years, had called him that even after the wedding. But now, unprompted and natural as breathing, the boy had called him father. Elara had stopped talking, her attention fully on them. Xavier saw tears glittering in her eyes, a smile on her lips. Yes, Xavier managed, his voice rough. Let us light the bonfire. Corwin grabbed his hand and dragged him toward the unlit woodpile in the center of the yard. Xavier lit the kindling, and flames caught and spread, climbing through the logs until a proper blaze roared to life. The gathered crowd cheered, children dancing around the fire while adults drew closer to its warmth. Xavier felt Elara's hand slip into his free one, Corwin still holding his other hand. They stood together, the 3 of them, bathed in firelight and surrounded by community, and Xavier thought about the strange path that had brought them here. A seed invoice. A week that became 3 years. A ring carried for months before finding its proper home. Happy? Elara asked quietly. Yes, Xavier said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. The party continued late into the night. Stories were told, songs were sung, and children slowly drooped into sleep and were carried home by their parents. Corwin fell asleep against Xavier's side, and Xavier lifted him easily, carrying him into the house and tucking him into bed. When he returned outside, most of the guests had departed. Elara was helping clean up, stacking dishes and banking the bonfire. Xavier joined her, working in the companionable silence they had perfected over the years. He called you father, Elara said as they worked. I heard, Xavier said. How did it feel? Xavier considered the question. Right, he said finally. It felt right, Elara smiled. Good, because you are his father in every way that matters. Blood does not make a parent, love does, choice does. You chose us, Xavier. You chose to keep us when we should have left. You chose to love us when it would have been easier not to. There was never a choice, Xavier said. Not really. From the moment I fixed that toy horse, I was lost. Lost, Elara repeated, teasing. Found, Xavier corrected. I was found. They finished cleaning and went inside, locking the door behind them. The house was warm and quiet, filled with the comfortable disorder of a home that was truly lived in. Xavier and Elara climbed the stairs together, checking on Corwin once more before retiring to their own room. Xavier lay in bed that night with Elara curled against his side, her breathing deep and even in sleep. Through the window he could see stars scattered across the sky, bright and distant. He thought about the life he had built, the family he had gained, the love he had found in the most unexpected place. 3 years and 1 ring ago, a tired orc woman had knocked on his door asking for a room. Xavier had said yes to 1 week and ended up with forever. He had no regrets, no doubts, no wishes that things had gone differently. He had everything he needed right here. Xavier closed his eyes and let sleep take him, content in the knowledge that tomorrow he would wake to Elara beside him, to Corwin's laughter in the kitchen, to the endless work of the farm and the endless joy of family. The seed invoice was still in his drawer, ink faded and paper creased from folding. Xavier would keep it there always, a reminder of how the best things in life often began with the worst handwriting and the simplest agreement. 1 week, 3 silver, a room to rent. It had seemed like nothing at the time. It had turned out to be everything. The seasons continued their turn. Winter came with snow that blanketed the fields and made the farmhouse feel like an island unto itself. Xavier taught Corwin how to ice skate on the frozen pond, holding the boy's hands as he wobbled and slipped and eventually found his balance. Elara watched from the shore, laughing at their antics, before joining them on the ice. They spent long evenings by the fire, Xavier reading aloud while Elara mended clothes and Corwin played with his wooden animals. Sometimes Corwin would fall asleep on the rug, and Xavier would carry him up to bed, tucking him in and brushing the hair from his forehead. "He grows so fast," Elara said one night, watching Xavier descend the stairs after putting Corwin to bed. "He does," Xavier agreed. "Soon he will be too big for me to carry." "He will always be our little boy," Elara said softly. Spring returned, bringing new growth and new work. Xavier and Corwin planted the fields together, the boy old enough now to handle real responsibility. He took pride in his rows, making sure each seed was properly spaced and covered. Xavier watched him work and felt a fierce swell of parental pride. Elara's garden expanded each year. She grew vegetables and herbs, flowers for the table, medicinal plants she had learned about from her own mother. The garden became her domain, and she tended it with the same care she brought to everything else in her life. Mistress Renwick reported that Corwin was one of her best students, quick with numbers and devoted to reading. He had friends among the village children, both human and the handful of other non-human families in the area. The world was changing slowly, old prejudices fading as people realized that orcs and humans were not so different after all. Summer brought long days of work and longer evenings of rest. Xavier and Elara would sit on the porch after dinner, watching the sun set over the fields while Corwin chased fireflies or played with the barn cats. "Do you ever think about having more children?" Elara asked one evening. Xavier looked at her surprised. "Do you want more children?" "I do not know," Elara admitted. "I love Corwin so much. I wonder sometimes what it would be like to have another, but I am also happy with how things are." "We have time to decide," Xavier said. "There is no rush," Elara nodded, leaning against him. "No rush," she agreed. But life had its own plans, as it often did. By autumn, Elara was pregnant. The pregnancy was healthy, and she continued working the farm until she grew too large to move comfortably. Corwin was excited about becoming a big brother, already planning all the things he would teach the new baby. Xavier found himself terrified and elated in equal measure. He had not been there for his first wife's pregnancy, had not experienced the waiting and wondering. Now he counted the days, making sure Elara had everything she needed, worrying over every small complaint. "I am fine," Elara assured him repeatedly. "Women have babies every day. I am strong. The baby is strong. Stop fussing." But Xavier could not help fussing. He built a cradle from oak, carving it with careful attention to detail. He prepared the spare bedroom as a nursery, painting the walls a soft yellow. He read every book on childbirth he could find, until Elara threatened to hide them all. The baby arrived in the dead of winter, during a snowstorm that made fetching the midwife an adventure. But Mistress Carver arrived in time, and after long hours of labor, a healthy baby boy entered the world. They named him Connor, and Corwin proclaimed him the best brother anyone could ask for, even though the infant mostly just slept and cried. Xavier held his son for the first time and felt something shift in his heart. This child was his by blood as well as choice, a tiny person who looked up at him with unfocused eyes and gripped his finger with surprising strength. "He is beautiful," Xavier said. "He is wrinkly," Elara said, but she was smiling. "Give him a few weeks." Corwin proved to be an excellent big brother. He helped fetch diapers and sang to Connor when he cried and sat by the cradle for hours, just watching the baby sleep. Xavier watched his two sons together and felt gratitude wash over him. This was his family. The one he had built from a chance meeting and a rented room and 3 years of slow, steady falling. Connor grew quickly, as babies did. By spring he was smiling and laughing, reaching for toys and batting at the mobile Xavier had hung over his cradle. By summer he was sitting up on his own, babbling nonsense and delighting in the attention of his parents and brother. The farm prospered. Xavier hired seasonal help for harvest, workers who were paid fair wages and treated well. The income from the crops allowed for small luxuries, a new dress for Elara, books for Corwin, toys for Connor. They were not wealthy, but they were comfortable. They were not grand, but they were happy. Life continued its rhythm. Seasons passed. Corwin grew from a boy into a young man, tall and strong and smart. He continued school and talked about maybe becoming a teacher himself someday, or perhaps a scholar. Xavier supported whatever path he chose. Connor grew too, a cheerful child who loved helping in the fields and playing with the animals. He had his mother's green skin and his father's dark hair, a perfect blend of both parents. Elara and Xavier grew older together, their love deepening with each passing year. They had arguments, as all couples did, but they learned to navigate them with patience and communication. They had hardships, as all farmers did, but they faced them together. On their 5th anniversary, Xavier took Elara back to the church where they had married. Father Thomas had passed the previous winter, but a younger priest named Father Michael had taken over. He renewed their vows in a small, private ceremony, with Corwin and Connor as witnesses. "I, Xavier Harlow, take you, Elara Harlow, to be my wife," Xavier said, holding both her hands in his. "I promise to love you, to honor you, to stand beside you through all the days of our lives. I, Elara Harlow, take you, Xavier Harlow, to be my husband," Elara said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I promise to love you, to honor you, to build a life with you that is full of joy and purpose." They exchanged new rings, simple bands that matched the original. Corwin and Connor clapped, and Father Michael blessed them once more. That evening they held a small celebration at the farm. Their closest friends attended, Mistress Renwick and Torrance and Mistress Carver and a dozen others who had become like family over the years. Corwin made a toast. "To my parents," he said, raising his glass, "who taught me that family is not about blood but about love. Who showed me that home is not a place, but the people you choose to share your life with. Thank you for choosing us." Xavier felt his throat tighten with emotion. He looked at Corwin, this young man who had once been a shy 5-year-old hiding behind his mother's skirts, and felt overwhelming pride. "Thank you for letting us choose you," Xavier said. The party continued late into the night, and when everyone had gone home and the boys were asleep, Xavier and Elara sat together under the stars. "You remember that first night?" Elara asked. "When we sat at your table and ate stew in awkward silence. I remember thinking you were going to leave in a week and my life would go back to quiet," Xavier said. "I remember thinking your handwriting was terrible and wondering if I had made a mistake," Elara said, laughing. "My handwriting is still terrible," Xavier pointed out. "Yes, but now I find it endearing," Elara said. She took his hand, running her thumb over his knuckles. "I love you, Xavier Harlow. I have loved you for so long I cannot remember what it felt like not to love you." "I love you too," Xavier said. "You and our sons. You are my whole world." They sat in silence for a while, comfortable and content. The farm was quiet around them, the fields dark, the house warm with lamplight from the windows. "We should go inside," Elara said eventually. "Connor will be up early wanting breakfast." "He always is," Xavier agreed. They stood and walked to the house hand in hand. Before they went inside, Xavier paused and looked back at the land, at the fields he had worked for so many years, at the barn and the garden and the fence line. This was his legacy. Not just the farm, but the family he had built here. The love he had found and nurtured and grown. The choice he had made over and over to say yes instead of no, to open his door instead of closing it, to risk his heart instead of keeping it safe. It had all started with a seed invoice and a week that never ended. Xavier smiled and went inside, closing the door behind him. Tomorrow would bring new work, new challenges, new joys. But tonight was for rest, for peace, for the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived. 3 years and 1 ring ago, everything had changed. Xavier Harlow had been alone, a widower in a too-quiet house, going through the motions of living without really feeling alive. Now he was surrounded by family, by love, by purpose. He was a husband and a father, a farmer and a friend. He was happy in a deep, abiding way that had nothing to do with circumstances and everything to do with the people he shared his life with. He climbed the stairs to his bedroom, where Elara was already under the covers, waiting for him. Xavier slipped in beside her and she curled against him automatically, her head on his chest. "Good night, Xavier," she murmured. "Good night, Elara," he replied. He closed his eyes and let sleep take him, grateful for the life he had built, for the choices he had made, for the love he had found when he least expected it. The seed invoice was still in his drawer, faded and creased and perfect. Someday he would show it to Connor too, tell both his sons the story of how their family began. But for now, it was enough to sleep beside his wife, to know his children were safe in their beds, to feel the solid weight of a life well lived settling over him like a warm blanket. 1 week had become forever, and Xavier Harlow had no regrets at all. Years later, when Corwin had grown into a fine young man and Connor was on the cusp of adolescence, Xavier would think back to that first day and marvel at how much had changed. How a simple yes to a woman asking for a room had transformed everything. How love had crept in quietly, building itself brick by brick through shared meals and mended toys and coffee left warming on the stove. He would think about Elara reading that marriage contract for the first time, the way her face had lit up with joy and surprise. He would think about Corwin calling him father at the harvest supper, unprompted and natural. He would think about holding Connor for the first time, that tiny miracle that was both his and Elara's. Most of all, he would think about how lucky he was. Not everyone got a second chance at love, at family, at happiness. Not everyone said yes when opportunity knocked on their door wearing green skin and carrying a tired child. But Xavier had said yes, and that single word had changed everything. On their 10th anniversary, Xavier and Elara returned to the table where it had all begun. The kitchen had been remodeled over the years. New tiles on the floor and fresh paint on the walls, but the table was the same. Solid oak, worn smooth from use, bearing the marks of countless meals and conversations. Xavier pulled out the seed invoice, now carefully preserved in a frame. He set it on the table between them. "Our first contract," he said. Elara laughed, tracing the words with her finger. "1 week, 3 silver, look how far we have come." "Look how terrible my handwriting was," Xavier said. "Was," Elara teased. "Xavier, it still is," he grinned. "You married me anyway." "I did," Elara agreed. "Best decision I ever made." "Second best," Xavier corrected. "The best was knocking on my door." "Fair point," Elara conceded. They sat together at the old table, the same table where they had negotiated terms 10 years ago, where Xavier had slid a marriage contract across the surface, where they had eaten countless meals as a family. The weight of history sat comfortably between them, not heavy but grounding. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I had gone to the next farm instead?" Elara asked. "Every day," Xavier admitted. "And every day I am grateful you did not." "So am I," Elara said. Corwin and Connor came home then, bursting through the door with news of their day. Corwin was apprenticing with Mistress Renwick now, learning to be a teacher. Connor had discovered a love of working with wood and was learning carpentry from the village craftsmen. They all sat down to dinner together, the four of them, talking and laughing and sharing stories. Xavier looked around the table at his family, at the life he had built, and felt contentment settle deep in his bones. This was everything. This was enough. This was more than he had ever dared hope for. After dinner, after the boys had gone to their rooms and the dishes were washed, Xavier and Elara walked outside to look at the stars. It had become a tradition over the years, this quiet time together at the end of each day. 10 years, Elara said softly. It feels like a lifetime and like no time at all. I know what you mean, Xavier said. Thank you, Elara said suddenly. For what? For saying yes, Elara said. For letting us stay, for loving us, for being the man you are. Xavier pulled her close, kissing her forehead. Thank you for knocking on my door, for staying, for loving me, for being the woman you are. They stood together under the stars, husband and wife, partners in all things, and Xavier thought about the seed invoice in his drawer, about the terrible handwriting and the expired terms, and the way a single week had stretched into forever. He thought about Elara reading the marriage contract, about her laughter and her tears, about the ring that had sat in his pocket for months before finding its home on her finger. He thought about Corwin calling him father, about Connor's first smile, about all the moments big and small that had built this life. Most of all, he thought about love, the quiet, steady kind that grew over time, the kind that showed itself in actions rather than words, in coffee left warming and chairs built to the right height and toys carefully mended, the kind that transformed a house into a home and strangers into family. I love you, Xavier said, because sometimes the simple words were the best ones. I love you too, Elara replied. They went inside together, closing the door on the night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new moments to add to the collection they had built over 10 years. But tonight was for rest, for gratitude, for the quiet knowledge that they had built something worth keeping. 1 week, 3 silver, a room to rent. It had become a lifetime, a family, a love that would last forever. And Xavier Harlow, who had been alone and learned to be content with silence, was now surrounded by noise and chaos and love, and he would not change a single thing. The seed invoice remained in its frame, a testament to humble beginnings and terrible handwriting, and the way life could surprise you when you least expected it. Xavier smiled as he climbed the stairs to bed, Elara's hand warm in his, and thought about how grateful he was for that long-ago decision to say yes to a tired woman and her son. It had been the best yes of his life.